I broke into my coworker's locker because I was convinced he was poisoning me. 6 months ago, I was crushing it at work, selling more than anyone else on my team, and in line for a big promotion to manager that came with a massive pay raise. Now, I was the guy who fell asleep during meetings and forgot important client calls, and my boss Phil kept pulling me aside to ask if everything was okay at home with this concerned look that made me want to punch him. My performance review was in 2 weeks and I knew I was screwed. The weird part was, I felt fine at home, totally normal, but the second I got to the office, I could barely keep my eyes open. My wife thought I was having some kind of breakdown and kept suggesting therapy, which just made me feel worse. I started watching my coworker George really closely because he'd been competing with me for the same promotion, and suddenly he was 4 times his output while I was falling apart. George was always hanging around the break room in the mornings right when the coffee finished brewing, and he'd get this little smile on his face whenever I poured myself a cup. I told myself I was being paranoid, but then I noticed he was always the first one there and always way too happy about my screw-ups. I started writing down every single time George went near the coffee pot, keeping a notebook in my desk like corporate Sherlock Holmes. One morning I pretended to leave for a client meeting, then snuck back and watched through the break room window. George walked in, looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and poured something from a small bottle into the coffee pot. My heart was racing because I finally had proof. I burst through the door and grabbed his wrist, yelling about what he just put in there. George's face went totally white, and he stammered for a second before pulling away and showing me the bottle. "It's creamer, you psycho. I'm lactose intolerant," he said, backing away from me like I was dangerous. I felt like the biggest idiot in the world standing there while he waved the fancy creamer bottle in my face. Word got around the office that I'd freaked out on George over coffee creamer. That night, my wife sat me down with her parents, and they did this whole intervention about drug use. "We're worried about you," her dad said. "Are you taking pills? Drinking during the day?" I had no way to prove I wasn't. I couldn't sleep that night, so I started Googling the company and found LinkedIn profiles for 2 people who used to work on my team. Both of them had been top performers who left suddenly last year, and when I messaged them, one wrote back saying she'd had mysterious health problems that disappeared the day she quit. I started bringing coffee from home in a thermos, and suddenly I was sharp again, closing deals and remembering everything. The next day, I drank office coffee just to test it, and by noon, I was passed out at my desk. Someone was definitely doing this to me. I became obsessed with figuring out who, checking the break room cameras, but they were broken. Late one Friday night when everyone had left, I used bolt cutters on George's locker because I was sure he was hiding something. Inside, I found the creamer bottle, some protein bars, a change of clothes, and then something unexpected. Printed employee records, including mine, with notes in the margins about symptoms and dates. George had been investigating this too. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around to see George standing there staring at his broken locker. Before I could explain or run, he said something that changed everything. Thank God someone else noticed. I thought I was losing my mind. He'd been having the same symptoms for 3 months, falling asleep randomly and getting written up. He'd been too scared to tell anyone because it sounded crazy. We compared his notes with mine and realized it only happened on days we drank the office coffee, specifically the pot that our boss Phil made every morning in his special coffee maker. "Phil always insists we drink it," George said, "like he gets weird if we bring our own. He made this huge deal when I brought Starbucks one day." We looked at each other. We were both thinking the same thing. Why would our boss sabotage our promotions when it gets him a fat bonus too? We picked the lock on Phil's office the next day and found prescription bottles of sedatives in his bottom drawer with tape labels. My name, George's name, and 2 other names from people who'd quit last year. My bottle was almost empty. Underneath was a folder with Phil's son's resume and a memo recommending his son for manager once. The current candidates prove unfit due to performance concerns. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything, my hands shaking. George whispered, "What are we going to do? Should we call the cops?" I didn't answer. I just thought about 6 months of hell, my wife crying, everyone thinking I was on drugs. I slipped the evidence into my jacket and finally spoke. "The cops can wait." George looked at me confused. "What does that mean?" I walked out of that office without explaining, because what I was planning wasn't something I could say out loud. I sat in my car outside the office building with the photos pulled up on my phone, my hands still shaking from what we found in Phil's office. The parking lot was almost empty now, just a few cars scattered under the streetlights, and I kept scrolling through the pictures of those prescription bottles with my name on the label. George's texts kept lighting up my screen every few minutes asking what my plan was, what we were going to do, when we should call the police. I didn't respond, because I wasn't ready to admit what I was actually thinking about. The evidence was right here on my phone, enough to destroy Phil completely, put him in prison, ruin his whole life. Part of me wanted to handle this my own way before any cops got involved. wanted to make him feel the panic and fear I'd felt for 6 months straight. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, my mind racing through different scenarios, different ways I could make Phil suffer before turning him in. The drive home took 20 minutes but felt like 5, my brain moving too fast to notice the roads or stoplights. My wife was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked through the door, and the smell of garlic and chicken hit me as I dropped my keys on the counter. She asked how my day was without looking up from the stove, her voice carrying that careful tone she'd been using for months now. I opened my mouth to tell her everything, about Phil and the drugs and the evidence, but the words stuck in my throat like I was choking on them. She glanced over at me with that mixture of concern and doubt that had become so familiar, like she was waiting for me to finally admit I had a drug problem or a mental breakdown. I mumbled something about it being fine and headed upstairs before she could ask more questions. I locked myself in the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub, pulling up the photos again and staring at those prescription bottles with my name printed on tape labels. The rage built in my chest like pressure in a sealed container, hot and tight and dangerous. Phil had done this to me deliberately, systematically for 6 months, and everyone had believed I was the problem. My wife, her parents, my coworkers, everyone had looked at me like I was broken, or lying, or using drugs. I thought about Phil sitting in his office tomorrow morning, drinking his coffee, having no idea his whole world was about to explode. The thought made me smile in a way that felt wrong, but satisfying. George called me 3 times that night, and I let it go to voicemail each time, not ready to talk to him yet. Around midnight, when my wife was finally asleep, I answered on his 4th call, and his voice came through panicked and high. He said we needed to go to the police first thing in the morning, that sitting on this evidence made us look bad, made us look guilty of something. I told him I needed 1 day to think about how to handle this, just 1 day to figure out the right approach. George went quiet for a long time and then said, "Okay," in this small voice, but I could hear the fear behind it, the worry that I was going to do something stupid and violent. He made me promise not to do anything crazy, and I promised, even though I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. After we hung up, I couldn't sleep, just lay there in the dark next to my wife, listening to her breathe and thinking about Phil. I spent the entire night on my laptop researching Phil, finding his home address through a property records search, scrolling through his son Hank's social media profiles, looking up his wife's name and workplace. I was building a complete picture of his whole life, mapping out all the things he valued, all the people he cared about, imagining different ways I could make him suffer the way he made me suffer. I found photos of his house, a nice 2-story place in a good neighborhood, and photos of Hank at his college graduation looking proud and happy. Phil had poisoned me to clear the path for his son to get my promotion, had destroyed 6 months of my life for his kid's career advancement. The sun came up, and light started filtering through the bedroom window, and I realized I hadn't slept at all, just spiraled deeper and deeper into fantasies of revenge that felt both satisfying and terrifying. I imagined showing up at his house, confronting him in front of his family, making him admit what he did. I imagined sending the evidence to everyone he knew before calling the cops, destroying his reputation first. The fantasies got darker as the night went on, and by morning I felt sick and wired and dangerous. I called in sick to work and got in my car, driving to the address I'd found for Eddie Barton, the former employee who'd responded to my message about health problems. He lived in a small apartment complex about 30 minutes away, and when I knocked on his door, he looked surprised and confused to see me standing there. I asked if we could talk, and he invited me in, gesturing to a worn couch in his tiny living room. When I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos of Phil's office, the prescription bottles with the names, the memo about making candidates unfit, Eddie's face went completely pale. He sat down hard on the couch and stared at the screen, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the pictures. Eddie told me Phil had destroyed his career and his marriage, that he'd been in therapy for 2 years trying to rebuild his life after everyone thought he was having a breakdown. His wife had left him because she thought he was lying about being sick, thought he was making excuses for poor performance. He'd lost his job, his apartment, his savings, everything, and spent a year basically homeless and broken before finally getting stable again. Eddie's story hit me hard because it was exactly where I was heading before George and I found the truth. He never got proof, never got vindication, never got to show anyone that he wasn't crazy or lazy or incompetent. He just left the company broken and blamed, carrying the weight of everyone thinking he'd failed. When I told him I had evidence that could put Phil in prison, that we could finally prove what happened, Eddie got quiet for a long time and just stared at his hands. Then he asked me what I was planning to do with the evidence, his voice careful and measured. I admitted I didn't know yet. That part of me wanted revenge more than justice, wanted to make Phil hurt before turning him in. Eddie nodded slowly like he understood that feeling completely. Eddie told me something that shifted my perspective slightly, made the simple clarity of my anger start to crack. He said revenge fantasies had kept him sick for years, eating him alive from the inside, while Phil went on with his life completely untouched by Eddie's suffering. He'd spent thousands of hours imagining ways to hurt Phil, to expose him, to destroy him, and none of it had helped Eddie heal or move forward. The only thing that finally helped was accepting he'd never get the satisfaction he craved, that Phil would probably never face consequences for what he did. Eddie looked tired and sad when he said it, like someone who'd fought a long war and lost. I left his apartment feeling more confused than before, the simple clarity of my anger now muddied with doubt about what I actually wanted. The drive back felt longer, and I kept thinking about Eddie's words, about whether revenge would actually make me feel better, or just keep me tied to Phil forever. George texted me around noon saying he was going to the police with or without me by end of day, that he couldn't sit on this evidence any longer without it eating him alive. I met him at a coffee shop downtown, and we sat in a corner booth arguing in tense whispers while people around us ordered lattes and worked on laptops. George called me reckless and stupid for wanting to wait, said I was going to mess everything up with my need for drama and revenge. I accused him of being too scared to let Phil really pay, of wanting to hand everything over to the cops and hope they handled it. George's face got red, and he leaned across the table, saying he just wanted his life back, wanted to stop feeling sick and paranoid and violated. He said he didn't care about revenge, just wanted Phil stopped and punished and away from us. I realized sitting there that we wanted fundamentally different things from this situation, that George wanted closure and safety, while I wanted Phil to suffer the way we suffered. I agreed to go to the police station with George that afternoon, told him we'd do it the right way and let the justice system handle it. But first I did something I knew was wrong, something I couldn't tell George about. I went home and created a fake email account using a random name and temporary service, then attached copies of all the photos to emails. I sent them to Phil's wife at her work email, to his son Hank at his college address, and to 3 senior executives at the company whose emails I found on the corporate website. I wanted Phil to know his life was about to explode before the cops even knocked on his door, wanted him to feel the panic rising in his chest the way I'd felt it for 6 months. I wanted his wife to see what kind of man she was married to, wanted his son to know his dad was a criminal who'd poisoned people for Hank's career. The emails sent with little whooshing sounds, and I felt satisfaction mixed with shame, knowing I'd just made everything more complicated. George picked me up, and we drove to the police station in silence, the tension thick between us in the car. At the front desk, we asked to speak to someone about a crime, and got directed to a detective on the 2nd floor. Detective Greta Nowak was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and short gray hair, and she took us into a small interview room with a table and recording equipment. George and I told her everything, about the symptoms and the drugging and breaking into Phil's office, and I showed her the photos on my phone. Nowak's expression got more and more concerned as she scrolled through the pictures, zooming in on the prescription bottles and the memo about making candidates unfit. She said this was serious criminal assault, possibly attempted poisoning, and started asking detailed questions about timeline and symptoms, and when we first noticed problems. When she asked how we obtained the evidence, I lied smoothly and said Phil's office door had been open, and we saw the bottles sitting in plain view in his drawer. George backed me up with obvious discomfort, shifting in his chair and not making eye contact with Nowak. She looked skeptical, but wrote down our statement and said they'd need to secure the evidence from Phil's office immediately and bring him in for questioning. Detective Nowak stood up and gathered her notes from the table, tucking them into a folder with our statement paperwork. George and I walked out of the interview room and through the police station hallways that smelled like old coffee and cleaning products. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it, following George down the stairs and out to the parking lot where the afternoon sun felt too bright after sitting in that windowless room. We stood by our cars for a minute without talking, both of us processing what just happened, and then George said he'd wait to hear from the detective before doing anything else. I nodded and got in my car, watching him drive away before I pulled my phone out and saw 17 missed calls from the office. My stomach dropped because I knew something had gone wrong, that Phil somehow found out about the police report before they could secure the evidence. I scrolled through the call log and saw numbers from coworkers, from the main office line, from people I barely knew in other departments. The first voicemail was from someone in accounting asking if I knew what was happening with Phil, saying he was acting crazy and yelling at people. I deleted it and played the next one, this time from a guy on the sales floor saying Phil's wife had called the office screaming about photos and asking what the hell was going on. My hands started shaking because I realized the emails I sent had already reached her, that she'd confronted Phil before the police could get to his office. The third voicemail was from Phil himself, his voice high and panicked, demanding to know what I'd done and threatening to sue me for slander. I saved that one because it might be useful as evidence later. My phone rang again while I was listening to messages, and Detective Nowak's name popped up on the screen. I answered, and she immediately asked if I'd contacted anyone else about the case besides coming to the station. Her voice was sharp and annoyed, not the professional calm from the interview room. I lied smoothly and said I hadn't talked to anyone, that I didn't know how Phil found out so fast. She told me someone sent emails with the evidence photos to Phil's wife and company executives, and now Phil was in full panic mode, destroying potential evidence before they could secure it. I kept my voice confused and innocent, saying maybe George did it without telling me, and she made a frustrated sound like she didn't believe me at all. Detective Nowak warned me sternly about interfering with a criminal investigation, explaining that my actions could compromise the entire case if Phil's lawyers claimed evidence tampering. I apologized and promised I wouldn't do anything else, but I could tell from her tone she was watching me closely now, suspicious that I was playing games with the legal process. The call ended, and I sat in my car feeling a weird mix of guilt and satisfaction, knowing I'd caused chaos, but also knowing Phil was finally facing consequences. I drove home and found my wife making dinner in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with the radio playing some pop song I didn't recognize. She looked up when I walked in and asked how my day was, her face still carrying that worried expression she'd worn for months. I told her I needed to show her something important, and she put down the knife, wiping her hands on a towel while I pulled out my phone. I sat at the kitchen table and she sat next to me, and I started from the beginning, explaining the whole 6 months of being drugged by Phil. I showed her the photos of the prescription bottles with my name on them, the memo about making candidates unfit, the evidence of Phil's scheme to get his son the promotion. Her face went from confused to shocked to horrified as she scrolled through the pictures, her hand covering her mouth. She started crying immediately, tears running down her face while she kept saying she was sorry, that she should have believed me, that she felt terrible about the intervention. I wanted to feel happy that she finally understood, that I had proof I wasn't crazy or on drugs, but instead, I just felt exhausted and sad. We sat there at the kitchen table and she kept apologizing, reaching for my hand and squeezing it while tears dripped onto the phone screen. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Phil had fooled everyone, but I could feel something broken between us that wouldn't heal easily. The trust we'd built over years of marriage had cracked when she sided with her parents instead of me, when she believed I was lying about my symptoms. She wrapped her arms around me, and we held each other in the kitchen while the vegetables sat half-chopped on the cutting board. I felt her shaking against me and heard her whisper that she loved me, that she was so sorry, and I said it back, but the words felt heavy. We stayed like that for a long time until the sky outside got dark and neither of us felt like cooking anymore. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with a text from George saying Phil had been arrested at his home around 6 in the morning. I sat up in bed and read his message 3 times, feeling satisfaction spread through my chest like warmth. George sent another text saying the office was complete chaos, with executives running around trying to figure out what happened and why police had shown up to take evidence from Phil's office. I got out of bed and made coffee while my wife slept, standing in the kitchen reading more texts from coworkers asking if I knew anything. Someone sent a group message saying Phil had been escorted out in handcuffs, that he'd been shouting about being framed and demanding his lawyer. I smiled at my phone because finally Phil was the one panicking and scared. Finally, he was the one everyone was talking about. My phone rang, and I saw it was Derek Peacock from HR calling, his voice professional but stressed when I answered. He asked if I could come in for a meeting that morning to discuss the situation with Phil, and I agreed, even though Detective Nowak had specifically told us to stay away from the office. I wanted to see the aftermath of what we'd set in motion, wanted to walk through those halls knowing Phil was gone and everyone knew the truth. I got dressed and drove to the office, parking in my usual spot and walking through the front doors like any normal day. The receptionist stared at me with wide eyes, and I could hear people whispering as I walked past cubicles toward the HR department. Derek was waiting in a conference room with the door closed, and when I walked in, he looked tired and shaken, like he'd been up all night dealing with this mess. Derek asked me to sit down and started by saying the company was aware of the criminal investigation into Phil's conduct. He had a legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand, ready to take notes like this was any normal HR meeting. I told him everything from the beginning, about the 6 months of symptoms and performance problems, about finding the prescription bottles and the memo about Phil's son Hank. Derek wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the paper while I talked, and his face got more serious with each detail. I explained about the other victims who'd left the company, about how Phil had been doing this for years to clear the way for his son's career. Derek stopped writing and looked up at me, asking if I had proof, and I showed him the photos on my phone. He studied each picture carefully, zooming in on the prescription labels and the memo, and I watched his professional mask slip a little as he realized how bad this was for the company. He told me they were launching an internal investigation parallel to the criminal case, that they needed to understand how this happened and who else knew about Phil's behavior. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He explained I was placed on paid administrative leave until everything was sorted out, that it was standard procedure in situations like this. I asked why I was punished when I was the victim, and he insisted it wasn't punishment, just protocol to keep me away from the office during the investigation. But it felt like punishment, like the company was trying to hide me away and pretend this never happened. Derek promised my job was safe and I'd be paid full salary, but I left that conference room feeling angry and dismissed, like even with proof of what Phil did, I was still being treated as the problem. I walked out to the parking lot and saw Hank standing by his car, Phil's son, who I'd only met a few times at company events. He looked terrible, his eyes red and his face pale, like he hadn't slept at all. He saw me and actually walked over, his hands shaking at his sides. He asked if the accusations against his father were true, his voice cracking on the last word. I stopped walking and looked at him, this kid whose whole future had just exploded because of his dad's crimes. Part of me wanted to lie and make it easier on him, but a bigger part wanted him to know exactly what his father had done. I pulled out my phone and showed him one of the photos, the prescription bottle with my name on it sitting in Phil's desk drawer. Hank stared at the screen, and his face crumbled, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. I showed him the memo next, the one where Phil recommended his son for manager after making the other candidates unfit. Hank stepped back from me and put his hand over his mouth, and I could see him realizing that everything he thought he knew about his father was wrong. He asked if there were other victims, and I told him yes, at least 6 people that we knew about, maybe more. Hank started crying right there in the parking lot, tears running down his face while he tried to apologize for something that wasn't his fault. I told him I didn't blame him, but I wasn't sorry his father got caught, that Phil deserved whatever happened to him. Part of me felt bad watching this kid fall apart, but mostly I felt satisfied that Phil's family was suffering consequences too, that his crimes had destroyed more than just his victims' lives. I got in my car and drove home, and halfway there my phone rang with George's name on the screen. I answered, and he immediately started yelling about how I'd gone to the office when Detective Nowak specifically told us to stay away. His voice was high and angry, accusing me of being reckless and caring more about drama than actually getting justice. I pulled over into a gas station parking lot because I couldn't focus on driving while arguing. I told George I had every right to go to my own workplace, that the company called me for a meeting and I wasn't going to hide like I did something wrong. He said I was going to mess up the case with my need for revenge, that I couldn't just follow simple instructions from the detective. I snapped back that he was too passive and weak, that he was happy to let other people handle everything while I actually took action. George went quiet for a second and then said something that hit hard. He told me I cared more about making Phil suffer than about actually healing from what happened, that I was so focused on revenge, I couldn't see I was hurting myself. I told him to screw off and hung up, sitting in my car feeling angry and defensive. The truth was, he might have been right, but I wasn't ready to admit that. I realized our temporary alliance was already fracturing now that the immediate crisis was over, that we wanted different things from this whole situation. George wanted it done, and behind him, wanted to move on with his life. I wanted Phil to pay for every single day of hell he'd put me through. My phone rang again, and I almost didn't answer, thinking it was George calling back, but it was Detective Nowak's number. She told me they'd gone to Phil's office and found the prescription bottles exactly where they appeared in my photos, along with detailed records of dosages and timing for each victim. Phil was claiming the bottles were planted, that someone was framing him, but the evidence was overwhelming, and his story didn't make sense. Detective Nowak said they'd found records showing Phil had been doing this for 3 years, starting with 2 employees who'd left in 2020, then 4 more in 2021 and 2022, and finally George and me this year. At least 6 victims before us, maybe more they hadn't identified yet. The scope of his crimes was so much bigger than we'd realized. This wasn't just about me and George, it was a pattern of systematic abuse over years. She said the DA was building a strong case, and Phil would likely face multiple counts of assault and poisoning. I felt vindicated hearing all this, knowing the evidence was solid, and Phil couldn't talk his way out of it. But I also felt sick thinking about all the other people he'd destroyed, all the careers and lives he'd ruined, just to advance his son's prospects. Detective Nowak reminded me again not to interfere with the investigation, her tone making it clear she was still suspicious about those emails. I promised I wouldn't do anything else, and the call ended. That evening, my wife told me her parents had called asking to come over and apologize. I didn't want to see them, but she said they felt terrible about the intervention and wanted to make things right. They showed up an hour later with flowers and guilty expressions, standing awkwardly in our living room like they didn't know what to say. My wife's father actually had tears in his eyes when he told me how sorry he was, that he was horrified they'd accused me of drug use when I was poisoned. He said he'd been lying awake at night thinking about that intervention, about how scared and alone I must have felt. My wife's mother apologized too, saying she should have listened to me instead of assuming the worst. I told them I accepted their apology because what else could I say, but I felt distant from them, like we were strangers being polite. The relationship had changed permanently that day. They cornered me in my own home and treated me like an addict, and no amount of apologizing could undo that damage. My wife tried to smooth things over, making coffee and steering the conversation to safer topics, but I could tell she was uncomfortable too, caught between her parents and me. They stayed for an hour and then left, and after they were gone, my wife asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but we both knew I wasn't, that this whole situation had created cracks in relationships that would take years to repair if they ever did. The next afternoon, I got a call from someone named Margot Rivers, who introduced herself as the company's attorney. Her voice was smooth and professional, but I could hear nervousness underneath it. She explained the company wanted to avoid a lawsuit and was prepared to offer me compensation for what happened, that they took Phil's actions very seriously and wanted to make things right. I asked what kind of compensation, and she said they were still working out the details, but it would be substantial enough to acknowledge the harm I'd suffered. I told her I hadn't decided if I was suing yet, that I was waiting to see how they handled the internal investigation and whether they actually made changes to prevent this from happening again. Margot seemed surprised I didn't jump at the mention of money, and she asked what it would take for me to feel satisfied with the company's response. I said I wanted to know who else knew about Phil's behavior, whether anyone in management had ignored warning signs or complaints. She got quiet and then said the internal investigation would look into all of that. I could tell from her tone that the company was scared, that they knew they were liable for not catching Phil's crimes sooner. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with her and discuss a potential settlement, and I said maybe after I saw the results of their investigation. The call ended, and I sat there feeling like I had more power than I'd had in months. Like finally, I wasn't the one scrambling and desperate. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, just stared at the ceiling replaying everything in my head. The 6 months of falling asleep at my desk while everyone whispered about me. My wife's parents sitting me down like I was some kind of addict. Phil's face when he'd pull me aside with that fake, concerned look, knowing the whole time he was the one drugging me. My hands kept clenching into fists under the blankets, and my wife woke up around 3 in the morning asking if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but she could tell I wasn't, that I'd been lying there tense and angry for hours. She sat up and turned on the lamp, looking at me with tired eyes. She said maybe I should talk to someone professional about everything that happened, that even though Phil was arrested, I was still carrying all this rage around. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right, that I couldn't stop thinking about ways to make Phil suffer more than just getting arrested. I agreed to try therapy, even though the idea made me uncomfortable, like admitting I couldn't handle this on my own. The therapist's office was in a boring medical building with beige walls and those generic nature paintings. Polly Cardenas was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and glasses that made her look smart but not intimidating. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I just started talking, everything pouring out. The drugging, the investigation, finding the bottles with my name on them, Phil getting arrested. I even told her about the revenge thoughts I'd been having, the dark fantasies about making Phil's life hell beyond just the legal consequences. Polly listened without any judgment on her face, just nodding and taking occasional notes. When I finally stopped talking, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. She wanted to know what I actually wanted now that Phil was facing consequences. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have a good response. I'd been so focused on making him pay, on getting revenge for what he did to me, that I hadn't thought about what comes after. Polly leaned forward slightly and said, "My real work wasn't about Phil anymore. It was about processing the trauma and rebuilding trust with the people who doubted me." That sounded way harder than revenge, and I told her so. She smiled a little and said, "The hard path is usually the right one." George texted me 2 days later asking if we could meet for lunch. His message was different from before, less defensive, saying he wanted to apologize for calling me reckless. We met at a sandwich place near the office and sat in a corner booth away from other people. George looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping either, with dark circles under his eyes. He started apologizing right away, admitting he'd been struggling too with anger and feeling violated by what Phil did. I told him I got it, that we were both trying to figure out how to move forward from something completely messed up. We talked more honestly than we ever had before about the whole situation, about how we were both victims of Phil's crimes, even though we'd started as competitors. George mentioned he was also starting therapy and taking a leave of absence from work because he couldn't handle being in that building right now. I understood that completely. Our relationship wasn't quite friendship, but there was understanding between us now, like we were fellow survivors of the same disaster. When we left the restaurant, I felt less alone than I had since finding those bottles in Phil's office. Detective Nowak called me while I was driving home from the grocery store. She had an update about Phil's case, and her voice sounded careful, like she was worried about how I'd react. Phil's attorney was trying to negotiate a plea deal. He wanted to avoid trial and was willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. She asked how I felt about that, and I immediately felt anger rising in my chest. I told her I wanted Phil to face the maximum consequences, that he deserved to go to trial and get destroyed in front of a jury. Detective Nowak stayed calm and explained that trials are unpredictable, that sometimes juries don't convict even with solid evidence. A plea deal would guarantee Phil got a criminal record and served some time, even if it wasn't as much as we wanted. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and told her I needed to think about it. She said that was fine, that the DA's office would keep me updated on any developments. After we hung up, I sat in my parked car for 20 minutes, just feeling angry that Phil might get to avoid the full punishment he deserved. I brought up the plea deal option with my wife that evening while we were making dinner. She surprised me by saying she thought I should consider it. I stopped chopping vegetables and stared at her, asking what she meant. She explained that a trial would drag everything out for months or even years, keeping me stuck in this angry place where I couldn't move forward. I got defensive immediately, accusing her of wanting me to just let Phil off easy after everything he did to us. Her face got tight, and she said that wasn't fair, that she was worried about me being so consumed with punishing Phil that I wasn't healing. We had our first real fight since the truth came out, voices rising in the kitchen. I said she didn't understand how violated I felt, how much I needed to see Phil suffer. She fired back that she understood perfectly, that she'd watched me fall apart for 6 months, thinking it was her fault for not being supportive enough. She said I was, so focused on revenge that I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. I knew she was right, but I wasn't ready to admit it, so I just walked out of the kitchen and went to sit in the garage for a while. Margot Rivers called again the next afternoon with a specific settlement offer. 6 months paid leave with full benefits, a guaranteed promotion when I returned, and a substantial cash payment that she mentioned was in the low 6 figures. Her voice was professional, but I could hear the nervousness underneath, like she was reading from a script the company lawyers prepared. She emphasized that accepting the offer was contingent on me signing an NDA and agreeing not to sue the company for negligence. I told her I'd think about it, but the NDA part bothered me immediately. It felt like they were trying to silence me about their failures, about how they didn't catch Phil's behavior for years, even though there must have been warning signs. Margot tried to frame it as protecting everyone's privacy, but I could tell it was really about protecting the company from bad publicity. She asked when I might have a decision, and I said I needed at least a week. After the call ended, I sat there staring at my phone, thinking about how much money they were offering, and wondering if it was enough to make me stay quiet about their negligence. I reached out to Eddie Barton again, texting him to ask if we could talk about the settlement offer and the plea deal situation. He called me back within an hour, and we talked for almost 45 minutes. Eddie told me he wished he'd had the chance I have now to get some form of justice and compensation for what Phil did to him. He said he spent years angry and broke after leaving the company with nothing, no proof and no vindication, just a ruined reputation and a destroyed marriage. If he could go back, he'd take whatever win he could get and focus on rebuilding his life instead of staying stuck in anger. His perspective hit me hard because I could hear the regret in his voice, the years of bitterness that had eaten away at him. Eddie said holding out for perfect justice had left him with nothing but more pain. He told me to think carefully about what I actually needed versus what I wanted, because wanting Phil to suffer maximally might cost me the chance to get anything at all. After we hung up, I felt more confused than before, but also like I was starting to see things differently. At my next therapy session with Polly, I brought up the plea deal and settlement offers. She asked me to really examine what I wanted revenge to accomplish, what I thought would happen if Phil got the maximum sentence. I admitted I wanted him to suffer the way I suffered, to lose everything like I almost did. My voice got tight talking about it, and I could feel the anger rising again. Polly stayed quiet for a moment, and then asked if that would actually make me feel better, or just keep me tied to Phil emotionally. I didn't have a good answer, and sat there feeling frustrated that she was making me think about this, instead of just validating my anger. She leaned back in her chair and said something that stuck with me. True freedom might mean accepting that Phil's consequences won't perfectly match his crimes, and choosing to move forward anyway. That making peace didn't mean forgetting or forgiving. It meant refusing to let Phil control my emotional state anymore. I left that session feeling unsettled, but also like something had shifted slightly in how I was thinking about everything. Detective Nowak called me 2 days later with news that changed the plea deal situation. 2 more former employees had come forward after seeing news coverage about Phil's arrest. Both of them described the exact same pattern of symptoms and sudden performance decline that George and I experienced. The DA was now building a case showing systematic criminal behavior over multiple years with at least 8 total victims. Detective Nowak's voice had more energy now, saying that with this many victims, they were less willing to offer Phil a lenient plea deal. The case was bigger than they initially thought, and the DA wanted to make an example out of workplace poisoning. I felt satisfaction hearing that, like finally the scope of what Phil did was recognized. She said they'd keep me updated on how the plea negotiations progressed, but it was looking more likely they'd push for a trial. After the call, I felt vindicated that other people were coming forward, that I wasn't alone in what Phil had done. George texted me asking if I wanted to meet the other victims, and I agreed immediately. We gathered at a coffee shop across town, 6 of us total sitting around a big table in the back. It was surreal hearing their stories that mirrored ours so closely. One woman described losing her job and her apartment because everyone thought she was incompetent and unreliable. A man talked about his wife leaving him because she thought he was having an affair to explain his strange behavior and constant exhaustion. Another guy mentioned being hospitalized because doctors thought he had a brain tumor when it was just Phil's sedatives. We were all damaged by Phil in different ways, careers derailed and relationships destroyed, lives completely upended by one person's selfish crimes. Sitting there listening to them, I realized I wasn't alone in struggling with anger and the desire for revenge. Everyone at that table was wrestling with the same questions about justice and healing and moving forward. We exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in touch, forming an unexpected support group of people who truly understood what we'd been through. Someone at the table suggested we should all hire a lawyer together and explore a class action lawsuit against both Phil and the company. The idea spread around the group like electricity, and everyone started talking at once about how much stronger we'd be as a united group, instead of individual victims accepting whatever the company offered. George pulled out his phone and started searching for employment lawyers who handled class action cases, while the rest of us debated whether going after the company was fair since Phil was the actual criminal. One woman pointed out that the company had to know something was wrong when multiple top performers suddenly crashed and burned, and another guy mentioned that HR definitely were ignored warning signs because nobody wanted to investigate the boss. I sat there listening and realized Margot's settlement offer didn't look nearly as good when I thought about the leverage we might have as a group of 8 victims with identical stories. We exchanged more contact information and agreed to meet again in 3 days after everyone had time to think about whether they wanted to join a class action or take individual settlements. I drove home feeling energized by the possibility of holding the company accountable for enabling Phil's crimes for years. The next morning, I called Margot back and told her I was declining the individual settlement because I was joining the other victims in collective legal action. She went quiet for a second, and I could hear her typing something on her keyboard before she responded. Margot said she wasn't surprised by my decision, but warned me that litigation could take years, and there were no guarantees we'd win anything. I told her I understood the risks, but needed to see this through properly, and she ended the call sounding frustrated, but professional. My wife was in the kitchen making lunch when I got off the phone, and I told her about declining the settlement to join the class action. She stopped cutting vegetables and turned to look at me with concern all over her face, asking if I was sure about turning down guaranteed money for a lawsuit that might drag on forever. We sat down at the kitchen table and had a long conversation about the financial cost and emotional toll of a prolonged legal battle. I explained that taking a quick settlement would feel like letting the company off easy for their negligence in not catching Phil's behavior when multiple employees showed the same pattern of sudden decline. She listened without interrupting, and then said she'd support my decision, but asked me to promise I'd keep going to therapy and not let this lawsuit consume my whole life the way the investigation and criminal case had. I promised her I'd stay in therapy and maintain balance, though sitting there making that promise I wasn't totally sure I could keep it. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, saying she just wanted me to heal and move forward instead of staying stuck in anger about what Phil did. 3 days later, the victim group met again at a different coffee shop, and everyone except one person had decided to join the class action lawsuit. We pooled money to hire an employment lawyer who specialized in workplace safety cases and had experience with class action suits against large companies. The company must have gotten wind of our plans because within a week, they announced they were placing several executives on administrative leave while they conducted an internal investigation into who knew about Phil's behavior. Derek from HR was one of the executives placed on leave, and rumors started spreading through the office that he'd ignored complaints about Phil years ago from employees who'd since left the company. George texted me screenshots of internal emails that were getting leaked, showing that at least 2 former employees had reported feeling unwell at work and suspecting something was wrong with the office coffee. The scandal was growing way bigger than just Phil's individual crimes and was exposing major problems with how the company handled oversight and accountability. I felt vindicated seeing the company finally face real consequences for their negligence in protecting employees. Detective Nowak called me a week later with news that Phil's plea deal had completely fallen apart. The DA saw all the evidence from the 2 new victims, plus the leaked emails showing the company knew something was wrong, and they decided to take the case to trial, pursuing way more serious charges that could mean significant prison time for Phil. Detective Nowak told me I'd need to testify at trial and asked if I was prepared for that. I said yes immediately, feeling both nervous and eager to face Phil in court and tell my story to a jury. She warned me that Phil's defense lawyer would try to make me look bad on cross-examination, and I needed to stay calm and stick to facts. George called me right after I hung up with Detective Nowak because she'd called him too about testifying. He sounded terrified, saying he didn't know if he could handle being questioned by lawyers in front of a courtroom full of people. I talked him through it and reminded him that we had truth on our side with all the physical evidence and multiple victims with identical stories. He agreed it was necessary, but I could hear the fear in his voice about the whole trial process. My administrative leave finally ended 6 weeks after Phil's arrest, and I went back to work on a Monday morning. The atmosphere was completely different from before, like walking into a familiar place that had been rearranged while I was gone. Phil was obviously gone, several executives were under investigation, and there was a new interim manager named Sarah who seemed genuinely concerned about employee well-being and kept asking if anyone needed support or had concerns about workplace safety. My coworkers treated me with this weird mixture of sympathy and awkwardness, not sure how to act around someone who'd been systematically poisoned by the boss for 6 months. Some people avoided eye contact, and others came up to apologize for not believing me when I was falling apart. I felt like a ghost walking through a place that used to be familiar, but now felt strange and uncomfortable. I was getting coffee in the break room on my 3rd day back, using my own thermos like I'd never trust office coffee again, when Hank approached me. Phil's son looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks, and he asked quietly if we could talk somewhere private. We went to an empty conference room and sat down across from each other at the big table. Hank apologized for his father and said he had no idea about any of the drugging or the scheme to make him look better for the promotion. He was clearly devastated, dealing with the reality that his dad was a criminal who'd hurt people just to advance Hank's career without him even knowing. I felt unexpected sympathy for him sitting there trying not to cry, realizing he was a victim of Phil's crimes too in a different way. We had an honest conversation where I told him I didn't blame him for his father's actions and understood he was dealing with his own trauma from finding out his dad was a monster. Hank thanked me and said he was thinking about leaving the company because everyone looked at him differently now. I told him he should do whatever felt right for his own healing, but that staying and proving himself on his own merits could also be powerful. My relationship with my wife started slowly improving as we worked through the trust issues in couples therapy with Polly. One session, my wife admitted she'd felt guilty for months about not believing me during those 6 months when I was drugged. She said the intervention with her parents haunted her because she'd essentially accused me of being an addict when I was actually being poisoned. I admitted I'd resented her for the intervention, even though I understood why she did it, and that resentment had created distance between us that was hard to close. Polly helped us communicate better about the hurt and fear we'd both experienced, and we started rebuilding intimacy that had been damaged by Phil's crimes. It was slow progress, like learning to trust each other again from scratch, but it felt genuine and deeper than what we'd had before. The class action lawsuit moved forward with 8 victims now officially participating, and our attorney seemed confident we had a strong case against the company. He explained that we were pursuing claims for negligent supervision and failure to investigate previous complaints about Phil that were documented in those leaked emails. Margot called me twice trying to negotiate a settlement with our group, but we held firm on our demands for substantial compensation plus mandatory policy changes at the company to prevent future incidents. Our attorney said the company was starting to realize we were serious and had begun making actual reforms to their oversight procedures and employee safety protocols. Months passed, and the trial date got closer while I continued therapy and focused on doing good work in my manager role. I was doing better mentally, still angry about what Phil did, but not consumed by revenge fantasies anymore, like I had been right after discovering the evidence. Therapy helped me process the trauma and understand that my healing wasn't dependent on Phil getting the maximum possible sentence. I was nervous about testifying, but also ready to tell my story in court and make sure Phil was held accountable for his crimes. George and I had become genuine friends through this whole process, bonded by shared experience in a way that felt different from normal friendships. The trial began on a cold morning in November, and it was intense from the very first day. Phil's defense attorney tried to paint us as disgruntled employees who'd fabricated evidence because we were mad about not getting promoted, but the prosecution had the prescription bottles with our names on them. Phil's detailed records and testimony lined up from 6 different victims. I sat in the courtroom gallery watching Phil at the defense table, and he looked so much smaller than I remembered. No longer the confident boss who'd controlled my work life, but a desperate man facing serious prison time. I felt satisfaction seeing him there, but also this strange emptiness, like the moment I'd been building toward for months wasn't as cathartic as I'd expected it to be. The prosecution called my name, and I walked to the witness stand with my hands shaking slightly, trying to keep my breathing steady. I swore to tell the truth, and sat down facing the jury, 12 strangers who would decide if Phil paid for what he did to me. The prosecutor asked me to describe my experience, and I started talking about the 6 months of falling asleep at work, forgetting client calls, watching my performance collapse while everyone thought I was on drugs. I explained the intervention with my wife's family, how her dad accused me of taking pills while I had no way to prove I was poisoned. The prosecutor showed the jury photos of the prescription bottles with my name on them and asked me to identify them. I confirmed they were the bottles George and I found in Phil's office, the evidence that proved someone was systematically drugging me to destroy my career. Phil's attorney stood up for cross-examination and tried to suggest I fabricated the evidence because I was angry about not getting promoted. I stayed calm and pointed out that 6 other victims had the same symptoms, and Phil kept detailed records of dosages and timing. The attorney asked why I didn't go to police immediately after finding the bottles, and I admitted I considered handling it myself, that I was consumed with anger and wanted revenge. But I chose to report it properly because I wanted real justice, not just personal satisfaction. I made eye contact with Phil once during my testimony and saw something that looked like shame or maybe fear before he looked down at the table. Walking out of the courtroom after finishing my testimony, I felt physically lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight in my chest for months, and finally released it by telling the truth in front of everyone. George took the stand next and did an amazing job describing his parallel experience, how he'd been having the same symptoms and investigating on his own because he thought he was losing his mind. He explained the moment we discovered Phil's crimes together, finding the prescription bottles and realizing we'd both been victims of the same systematic poisoning. The other victims testified over the following days, and their stories created this overwhelming picture of Phil's criminal behavior spanning 3 years. One woman described losing her apartment because everyone thought she was incompetent and couldn't keep a job. A man talked about his marriage falling apart because his wife thought his strange behavior meant he was having an affair. Each testimony added more evidence that Phil had been doing this deliberately and repeatedly, sabotaging top performers to make his son look better for promotions. The prosecution's case was airtight with the physical evidence, the medical records and testimony from 8 victims, all describing identical symptoms. Even Phil's attorney seemed to know they were fighting a losing battle, objecting less as the trial went on and looking increasingly frustrated. The jury got the case on a Friday afternoon, and we all expected deliberations to take days or maybe weeks, but they came back less than 24 hours later on Saturday morning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The clerk read each verdict out loud, and I watched Phil's face get paler with each one, his attorney putting a hand on his shoulder like that would somehow help. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and the courtroom was packed when we all returned. Phil stood up when the judge asked if he had anything to say and started this rambling speech about how he was under stress and made terrible choices he regretted. He apologized to all of us, but it felt hollow, like he was just trying to reduce his sentence rather than actually feeling sorry for destroying our lives. The judge listened without expression and then delivered the sentence, 8 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5. It wasn't the maximum sentence Phil could have gotten, but it was substantial, real prison time that would take years from his life. Phil broke down crying when he heard the number, his shoulders shaking while his attorney tried to comfort him. I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and relief, but also residual anger that even 8 years didn't fully balance what he did to us. The 6 months of hell and damaged reputation and broken trust with everyone who doubted me. But I also felt ready to move forward, like this chapter was finally closed, and I could start rebuilding without Phil hanging over everything. The bailiff led Phil away in handcuffs, and I watched him shuffle out of the courtroom looking small and defeated, nothing like the confident boss who used to control my work life. The company settled the class action lawsuit 2 weeks after Phil's conviction, probably realizing they couldn't win after a jury found him guilty of everything we accused him of. Our attorney called a meeting with all 8 victims to go over the settlement terms, and the numbers were substantial, enough money to make a real difference in rebuilding our lives. But more important than the cash were the policy changes the company agreed to implement, comprehensive oversight reforms, and better reporting channels so employees could raise concerns without fear. They also issued a public apology, acknowledging their failures in not catching Phil's behavior sooner, admitting that complaints had been ignored and warning signs missed. It wasn't perfect justice because no amount of money could give us back those months of suffering and doubt. But it was real accountability, the company admitting fault and making changes that might protect future employees from going through what we did. Standing in that conference room with the other victims, I felt like we'd accomplished something meaningful by standing together and refusing to accept a quick settlement that would have silenced us. George shook my hand and said he was glad we fought for this, that the policy changes mattered more than any dollar amount. I got promoted to the manager position about a month later, the job I'd been competing for when Phil started drugging me to sabotage my chances. My new boss called me into her office and offered me the role with a significant pay raise and expanded responsibilities. It felt bittersweet because I'd earned it through surviving Phil's crimes rather than through my actual sales performance like I'd planned. My first day as manager was weird, walking into meetings and giving directions to some of the same people who doubted me during those 6 months when everyone thought I was failing or using drugs. I made a point of having one-on-one conversations with each team member, telling them I understood why they'd been concerned and I didn't hold it against them. I was determined to be the kind of leader Phil never was, someone who actually cared about employee well-being instead of sabotaging people for personal gain. The role came with challenges I hadn't expected, like managing people who still seemed uncomfortable around me because of everything that happened. But I focused on proving myself through actions, being available when my team needed support, and creating an environment where people felt safe raising concerns. George decided to leave the company despite the settlement money and all the reforms they implemented. He came to my office one afternoon and told me the building held too many bad memories, that he needed a fresh start somewhere else to really move past what Phil did. I understood completely because I'd thought about leaving too, wondering if staying meant I'd always be the guy who got poisoned by his boss instead of just a regular employee. George said he'd accepted a job at a competitor with better pay and a clean slate where nobody knew about the trial or the drugging. We promised to stay in touch and actually meant it, exchanging phone numbers and making plans to meet for lunch after he started his new position. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time since I'd known him, excited about the future instead of weighed down by the past. His departure made me question my own choice to stay, but I decided I wanted to reclaim this space that Phil had tried to take from me. Leaving would feel like letting Phil win in some way, like he'd successfully driven me out even after going to prison. I wanted to prove I could thrive here, turn my manager role into something positive instead of running away from the trauma. My relationship with my wife reached this new level of honesty and intimacy over the months after the trial ended. We'd been through hell together and somehow came out stronger on the other side, with better communication and deeper trust than we'd had before Phil started poisoning me. We started couples therapy to work through the damage from those 6 months when she thought I had a substance problem and I resented her for not believing me. The sessions were hard, both of us admitting things we'd been holding back about feeling hurt and scared during that time, but slowly, we rebuilt something that felt more solid than what we'd had before, based on really knowing each other instead of just going through the motions. One night, she told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything, choosing to pursue legal justice even when the revenge fantasies were tempting and probably easier. We started talking about future plans that had nothing to do with trials or lawsuits, discussing maybe starting a family now that the Phil nightmare was finally over. She wanted kids, and I realized I did too, that I was ready to create new life and focus on building something positive instead of dwelling on what Phil had tried to destroy. I ran into Phil's wife at the grocery store about 6 months after the trial and almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked exhausted and sad, her hair grayer than I remembered, and her face showing stress lines that hadn't been there before. She saw me and walked over, apologizing for what Phil did and saying she'd had no idea he was poisoning people at work. She told me she was divorcing him and trying to rebuild her life, that finding out about his crimes had destroyed everything she thought she knew about their marriage. I said I didn't blame her for what Phil chose to do, that she was a victim of his choices too in a different way. She started crying right there in the produce section and thanked me for not being cruel to Hank, saying her son was struggling with having a father in prison, but trying to build his own career separate from Phil's shadow. I told her Hank seemed like a good person who was working hard to prove himself on his own merits. The whole encounter was awkward, but somehow humanizing, reminding me that Phil's crimes had rippled out to hurt his own family in ways I hadn't really thought about. His wife and son were dealing with the shame and fallout of his choices, their lives permanently changed by what he did to advance Hank's career. Walking back to my car, I felt grateful that my own marriage had survived and even strengthened through the nightmare instead of being destroyed like Phil's family. My wife and I went out for dinner on the 1-year anniversary of Phil's conviction, and I realized during the meal that I'd gone whole days recently without thinking about the drugging or the trial. The trauma was still there, probably always would be on some level, but it didn't dominate my thoughts anymore like it had for months. I was genuinely happy in my manager role, enjoying the work and the responsibility of leading my team. My marriage was solid, better than it had been before Phil started poisoning me, because we'd learned to communicate honestly about hard things. The settlement money had given us financial security, and we were making plans for the future instead of just surviving day to day. My wife raised her glass and made a toast to surviving and thriving, to choosing to move forward instead of staying stuck in anger and trauma. I felt grateful for her support through everything, for sticking with me even when she thought I was having a breakdown and everyone was telling her I had a drug problem. We were planning a vacation to somewhere warm and relaxing, something fun and normal that had nothing to do with crime or courts or revenge. Just two people who'd been through hell together, enjoying being alive and happy on the other side. Eddie Barton reached out a few days after our anniversary dinner, sending me a message saying he wanted to thank me for getting justice he never could. We met for coffee at a place downtown, and he looked healthier than when I'd visited him at his house months ago, less haunted by what Phil had done to him. Eddie told me that seeing Phil convicted and the company held accountable had helped him find closure for his own experience, that he'd finally been able to stop obsessing over the injustice of never getting proof. He was in a healthy relationship now and working at a job he loved, building a life that wasn't defined by being Phil's victim. Eddie said he was glad I didn't let revenge consume me the way it almost did to him, that I chose the harder path of legal justice instead of doing something I'd regret. Our conversation felt like passing a torch somehow, both of us moving forward from Phil's shadow into lives that were about more than what he'd done to us. I told Eddie about the victim advocacy work I'd gotten involved in, pushing for stronger workplace safety laws and better reporting channels. He said that was exactly the kind of positive change that made the whole nightmare worth surviving, turning trauma into something that helped other people. We finished our coffee and shook hands, two guys who'd been through similar hell and come out the other side, determined to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. The support group kept meeting every month at the community center, and over time the focus shifted from talking about legal stuff to actually helping each other heal from what Phil did to us. We'd sit in a circle and share how we were doing, some people having good weeks, and others struggling with nightmares or trust issues at their new jobs. Nobody judged anybody for still being messed up about it, because we all understood that kind of trauma doesn't just disappear when the trial ends. I started to see these people as real friends, not just fellow victims connected by shared misery. We talked about pushing for new laws to make workplaces safer and create better ways for employees to report this kind of thing without getting fired or ignored. The idea that our nightmare could lead to protecting other people from similar situations made everything feel slightly less pointless. A letter showed up at my house about 3 weeks later with a prison return address and Phil's inmate number printed in the corner. I opened it and found 6 pages of his handwriting explaining how stressed he was about his son's future and how the pressure to help Hank succeed made him do crazy things he regretted every single day. Phil wrote that he thought about us constantly and wished he could take it all back, asking if I could find it in my heart to forgive him. I read through it once, feeling absolutely nothing while his words tried to make excuses for 6 months of poisoning me and destroying my reputation. I walked to the kitchen and threw the whole thing in the trash without responding because I had zero interest in making Phil feel better about his choices. He wasn't someone I hated anymore, or someone I forgave, just a sad guy who wrecked his own life along with hurting ours, and now had to sit in prison thinking about it. My annual performance review at work came back with excellent ratings across every category, and I got called into a meeting with the CEO, Cyrus Pendleton, who told me I was doing amazing work as a manager. Cyrus said my leadership during the whole scandal and afterward showed real character, and the company was lucky to have me helping rebuild a healthier workplace culture. The reforms we'd pushed for were actually making a difference, with new reporting systems and regular check-ins that made people feel safe bringing up concerns. A few team members who doubted me during those 6 months when everyone thought I had a drug problem came to my office separately to apologize for not believing me. I worked hard to create an environment where my team trusted me and felt comfortable speaking up about problems, turning my own trauma into something positive that protected other people from going through what I did. My wife sat me down one evening after dinner with this nervous, excited look on her face and told me she was pregnant. We both started crying immediately, happy and scared at the same time about bringing a kid into the world after everything we'd survived together. The timing felt right, though, like we'd healed enough from the Phil situation to be ready for this next chapter. I kept thinking about what kind of father I wanted to be and what kind of man I wanted my child to see when they looked at me. Phil's crimes taught me hard lessons about integrity and choosing to do the right thing even when the wrong thing feels easier or more satisfying. I wanted to pass those lessons down to my kid without passing down the trauma and anger that came with learning them. George called me out of nowhere one afternoon to say he was engaged and wanted me at his wedding, which surprised me since we'd barely known each other before Phil's drugging brought us together. The wedding was beautiful, and during the reception, George asked me to give a joint toast with him about surviving hard times and finding real friendship in unexpected places. We stood up with our glasses and talked about how darkness can lead to light if you choose to move forward instead of staying stuck in anger. His fiancée came up to me afterward and thanked me for supporting George through the trial and everything that came after, saying I'd helped him heal more than I probably realized. Walking away from that wedding, I understood that one of the genuinely good things to come from the nightmare was this friendship built on shared experience and real respect, instead of just working in the same office. The company's HR department reached out a few months later, asking if I'd speak at a management training session about recognizing signs of workplace problems and creating safe ways for employees to report concerns. Standing in front of 50 managers and talking about being systematically poisoned by my boss felt uncomfortable and exposing, but I agreed because preventing this from happening to someone else mattered more than my discomfort. I walked them through the warning signs everyone missed, the broken reporting systems that let Phil operate for years, and the changes we'd implemented since. Several managers approached me afterward with questions about situations they'd observed in their own departments, and I realized my experience gave me a platform to create real change beyond just my own team. Being a survivor meant I could use what happened to me to help protect other people, which felt like the best possible way to turn pain into purpose. My therapy sessions with Polly dropped down to once a month instead of weekly, and she told me during one appointment that I'd made really impressive progress in processing everything and rebuilding my life. We talked about how I'd transformed my anger into advocacy work and chosen healing over revenge, even when the revenge fantasies were tempting during those early days. Polly asked if I had any regrets about how I handled things, and I admitted I wished I hadn't sent those photos to Phil's family before going to the police. That was me trying to hurt Phil in the moment instead of thinking about the bigger picture. But looking back at everything else, I felt proud of the choices I made and the person I'd become through surviving this experience. The trauma would probably always be part of me on some level, but it didn't control me anymore. My son arrived on a Tuesday morning after 14 hours of labor, and holding him for the first time made every single thing I'd gone through feel worth surviving. I was here, alive and present for this moment, because I'd survived Phil's poisoning and chosen to fight for justice instead of letting revenge destroy me too. My wife and I decided to name him after her father, which healed that relationship completely after the damage from the intervention when they thought I was using drugs. Looking down at my son's face, I felt hope about the future in a way that seemed impossible during those dark months when I was drugged and everyone doubted me. This tiny person represented a fresh start and a reason to keep choosing the harder right path over the easier wrong one. 5 years passed, and I got a letter from the parole board saying Phil was up for early release and asking if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement. I sat down and wrote honestly about the lasting effects his crimes had on my life, my marriage, and my mental health, the months of thinking I was losing my mind and having everyone believe I had a substance problem. But I also wrote about how I'd healed and rebuilt my life, how his actions didn't ultimately destroy me even though they easily could have. The parole board reviewed everything and denied his release, deciding he needed to serve more time before getting out. I felt satisfied with the outcome, but I wasn't obsessed with it anymore like I might have been years earlier. My life had moved so far beyond Phil and his crimes that his parole hearing was just a small interruption in my actual life, not the main event. The company promoted me to senior director a few months after Phil's parole got denied, putting me in charge of multiple teams across different departments. This was the career success I'd been working toward before Phil tried to sabotage me, and finally achieving it felt like proof that I'd won by refusing to let his actions define my future. Hank was doing well in a completely different department, proving himself through his own work instead of his father's schemes. We maintained a polite professional relationship when we crossed paths in meetings, and I respected his determination to build his own reputation separate from what Phil did. He could have quit and run away from the whole situation, but instead, he stayed and worked twice as hard to show he deserved to be there on his own merits. My wife and I started house hunting 6 months after the settlement came through, driving around neighborhoods on weekends looking at places that could actually be ours instead of rentals. We found a 3-bedroom house with a yard and a garage, nothing fancy but solid and real, and signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon with our son squirming in my wife's arms. Moving day was chaos with boxes everywhere and furniture that didn't quite fit where we thought it would, but standing in our living room that first night felt like proof we'd actually made it through everything. We planned a housewarming party for the following weekend, and I texted George and Eddie and the other people from the support group, wanting to share this moment with the people who understood what it meant. The day of the party, I set up folding tables in the backyard, and my wife arranged food, while our son crawled around exploring his new home. George arrived first with his wife and a bottle of wine, then Eddie showed up with his girlfriend, then 3 other people from the group I'd gotten to know over the past year. We stood around the yard, eating and talking, and I looked at these people who'd become real friends through the worst experience of our lives, feeling grateful for the unexpected community that formed from shared pain. The party went late into the evening with everyone laughing and sharing updates about their lives and cleaning up afterward. I felt like this house represented everything Phil tried to take from us, but couldn't. 3 months later, I got a letter from the parole board saying Phil was released after serving 6.5 years, and they wanted to know if I had any objections or wanted to submit a statement. I read the letter twice standing at my mailbox, feeling anger rise up automatically because 6 years didn't seem like enough for what he did to us. But then I went inside and looked at my son playing on the floor and my wife making dinner and realized I didn't actually care that much anymore about Phil or his release date. He was a broken man who destroyed his own life along with harming ours, and I was focused on my career and my family and my future, not on tracking some guy who'd become irrelevant. I threw the letter in the recycling and didn't write a statement because Phil had become just a bad memory that was fading with time, not the center of my world anymore. The victim advocacy group I'd been part of started meeting with state legislators about workplace safety laws, pushing for better monitoring and easier reporting channels, so what happened to us couldn't happen to others. We spent months meeting with representatives and building support, explaining how Phil operated for years without anyone catching on because the systems were broken. I testified at the state capitol on a Tuesday morning, standing at a microphone in a committee room telling my story to a dozen legislators who took notes. The bill passed with support from both parties and got signed into law 6 months later, officially named after our case as a reminder of why these protections mattered. Knowing that our experience led to legal changes that would help other workers felt like meaningful purpose from trauma, bigger than Phil's conviction or his prison sentence. This felt like the real victory, turning our pain into something that protected people we'd never meet. My son's first birthday party filled our house with family and friends, including my wife's parents, who'd become devoted grandparents after their guilt from the intervention. I set up decorations while my wife baked a cake, and people started arriving around noon with presents and cards. Watching everyone celebrate my son, I thought about how different my life could have been if Phil had succeeded in destroying my career and reputation, if I'd been fired and blacklisted and broken. Instead, I was surrounded by love and success, having turned the worst experience of my life into motivation for positive change. My wife's father pulled me aside and told me he was proud of how I handled everything, which meant more than I expected coming from someone who once thought I was using drugs. I was genuinely happy in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever feel again during those dark months when everyone doubted me. George called me on a Thursday evening to say his wife had their baby and asked if I'd be the godfather, and I drove to the hospital that night to meet the tiny person who'd just entered the world. At the baptism ceremony 2 months later, George pulled me aside in the church hallway and thanked me for pushing to get justice when he was too scared. He said if I hadn't been stubborn about pursuing the case, Phil might never have faced consequences, and they'd both still be damaged by doubt about what really happened. I told him we saved each other, that his evidence and support were just as important as my determination, that neither of us could have done it alone. Our friendship had become one of the most valuable things in my life, built on shared trauma, but grown into something real and lasting. I ran into Detective Nowak at a community safety event where I was speaking about workplace crime, and she approached me afterward with a smile. She told me our case was one of the most satisfying of her career, because she'd seen too many workplace crimes go unprosecuted when victims were afraid to come forward. She said watching all of us pursue justice despite the personal cost restored her faith that the system could work when people had courage. Her words meant a lot, validating that we made the right choice in reporting Phil and seeing the case through trial instead of taking revenge or staying silent. Eddie sent invitations to everyone from the victim support group for his wedding, and we all showed up on a Saturday afternoon to celebrate not just his relationship, but how far we'd all come in our healing. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, and during his speech, Eddie talked about how he almost let Phil's crimes define the rest of his life until seeing us get justice helped him finally move forward. He thanked us for showing him that healing was possible and that choosing to rebuild was stronger than staying broken. The wedding felt like a collective victory lap for all of us who survived Phil's systematic cruelty and refused to let it destroy us. My wife told me she was pregnant with our second child on a Sunday morning, and we both got excited about expanding our family now that we had the house and the stability. I'd been promoted again at work to a senior director role with real influence over company culture and policies, and the workplace was genuinely healthier than when I started with strong protections and open communication channels. I started mentoring younger employees who faced challenges, sharing my experience to help them navigate difficult situations without giving specific details about what happened to me. I'd transformed my trauma into wisdom that helps others, which felt like the best possible outcome from something so terrible. On the 5-year anniversary of Phil's conviction, I sat down at my computer and wrote a long post about my experience and recovery journey, talking honestly about the revenge fantasies I had and the temptation to handle things violently instead of legally. I described the choice to pursue justice and the long process of healing and rebuilding, hoping it might help someone else going through something similar. The post went viral in workplace advocacy circles, and I got hundreds of messages from people who'd experienced similar situations, thanking me for showing that justice was possible and healing was real, even when trauma felt overwhelming. Reading their messages made me realize my story gave hope to others, that sharing what happened could make a real difference. Phil died in a car accident 2 years after his release from prison, and I felt absolutely nothing when I heard the news from George, who'd seen it reported online. He'd been irrelevant to my life for years, just a bad memory that occasionally surfaced when I spoke about workplace safety or talked to someone from the support group. I didn't celebrate his death or mourn it, didn't feel closure or satisfaction or anything at all. I was too busy living my good life with my family and career to spare emotional energy on the man who tried to destroy me. And his death didn't change anything because I'd already found closure years ago by choosing to heal and move forward instead of staying stuck in anger. The email from the National Workplace Safety Coalition came 6 months after the legislation passed, asking me to speak at their annual conference about my experience and the legal changes that resulted from our case. I stood backstage at the convention center watching hundreds of HR professionals and safety advocates fill the auditorium, my hands sweating as I clutched my notes. The moderator introduced me, and I walked to the podium, looking out at all those faces waiting to hear my story. I started with the coffee pot, with 6 months of falling asleep at my desk while everyone thought I was on drugs, with my wife's parents doing an intervention in my living room. I told them about finding the prescription bottles with my name on them, about the choice between revenge and justice, about testifying in court and watching Phil get convicted. The audience was completely silent, leaning forward in their seats. I talked about the other victims, about Eddie and George and everyone else Phil hurt, about how we came together to push for legislative change. When I finished describing the new workplace safety monitoring requirements and mandatory reporting channels that came from our case, the entire auditorium stood up clapping. People were wiping their eyes. Afterward, at least 20 people came up to me sharing their own stories of workplace abuse and thanking me for showing that justice was possible. A woman from California told me she'd been dealing with a similar situation, and my story gave her courage to report it. A man from Texas said he was implementing new safety protocols at his company because of what happened to us. I realized, standing there, that I'd become something I never expected, an advocate and leader in a movement I accidentally joined by refusing to stay silent. 10 years after Phil first drugged my coffee, I'm a senior executive at a different company with real influence over workplace culture across multiple departments. My kids are 9 and 7, happy and healthy, running around our backyard while my wife and I drink coffee on the deck every Sunday morning. George and I still meet for lunch monthly, genuine friends who survived something terrible together. Eddie got remarried and sends Christmas cards every year. The legislation we fought for has been adopted in 12 states now, protecting thousands of workers. I look back at that moment in Phil's office when I said the cops could wait, and I'm grateful I didn't follow through on those revenge fantasies. Phil tried to destroy me, but instead I used his crimes as fuel to build something better, to create real change that matters. I won not by making him suffer, but by refusing to let his actions define who I became. I'm genuinely happy, successful, and at peace with everything that happened because I turned the worst experience of my life into purpose and used pain to create positive change for myself and countless others who will never know my name but benefit from the protections we fought for.